Hey friends, Ash here with ScentSplit. Hope you're doing really well. Today I'm going to be talking to you guys about 10 fragrances that define the 80s. The 80s have this kind of retro cool feel to them. That's why you have all these movies and music and TV shows and everything else that's, trying to bring that 80s vibe back into the present. And yet for some reason, 80s fragrances tend to get overlooked nowadays. They get written off as too old school, not wearable anymore. Yeah. I think that's BS. The 80s are friggin' awesome, including the fragrances. So let's jump into it. Let's talk about them. Now, these are 10 fragrances that helped define the 80s, at least in my opinion. There are a lot of fragrances, obviously, that I can't feature in this video, and maybe we'll do a follow-up in the future and talk about some more of them. Now, I have to start this off with the most obvious of the bunch for me, and this is a fragrance that I still absolutely love. I do not care what anybody out there says about this fragrance, including you. You, in the back, your taste sucks. No, I'm just playing. Where am I? But the fragrance that I'm talking about is this DRAKKAR Noir by KOUROS. This is the epitome of 80s for me. I absolutely love this fragrance still to this day. I think it smells fantastic. Yeah, the bottle is it's definitely cheap looking. The cap is trash and you don't even get a collar around the atomizer. What are you gonna do? I still really love it. It's friggin' great. It's got a barbershoppy vibe to it. It's got a ton of notes in it, like most fragrances in the 80s did. This was an enormous hit when it came out, even through the 90s as well. People were wearing the heck out of DRAKKAR Noir, and frankly, they still do. That's why it's being sold still to this day in big numbers. It's got oak moss, leather, fir, and lavender as some of the notes in the fragrance, and really that bunch of notes that I just listed off, you're gonna find those in just a mess of 80s fragrances, a whole bunch of them. And DRAKKAR Noir is a fragrance that you can pick up at discounters for next to nothing. Actually, a lot of these fragrances nowadays at discounters are hyper cheap. So even though DRAKKAR Noir gets hated on, even though it was worn to death, I still love it. Really though, I love just about all of these. Yeah, there's maybe like one or two I'm not a big fan of, but most of them. Next up, Dior Fahrenheit. This is also fantastic. Leather, violet leaf, nutmeg, and lavender. Again, some of the notes in the fragrance. This has an amazing opening. Now, some people don't like it so much, but I think it is top of the line, one of the most memorable openings of any designer fragrance ever. It's the type of fragrance where if you've smelled it once and you really paid attention to it, you'll be able to pick it up like that anytime you smell it. It is that unique, and it's because the opening has a gasoline smell to it, kind of a petrol vibe. And for me, it was just completely arresting the first time that I smelled it. I was just like locked in, blown away. Some people are not though. Some people smell that opening and they just hate it, despise it. Why would I want to smell like gasoline? I could just take gasoline and pour it on myself and smell the same. Well, first off, that's a terrible idea. Don't do that. It's also toxic, as well as very dangerous, flammable. But it's also completely unrealistic. Yes, you could say that Fahrenheit smells like petrol, but it's in a fantasy kind of way. It doesn't smell exactly like you poured gasoline on yourself. And Fahrenheit is another fragrance that is just an absolute classic. Love this stuff. Next up, let's talk about Cool Water by Davidoff. Now, you could say that Cool Water is just, Davidoff's interpretation of Green Irish Tweed by Creed, and you would be right, actually. That's what it is. But it's not the exact same. It does do some things differently, obviously. And Cool Water was one of the first men's fragrances that heavily used ambroxan. It wasn't the first fragrance that used ambroxan at all, but it was the first major release that really put that in there in big numbers. And look where we are today with every fragrance having some sort of amber woody accord to it. And these first 3 fragrances, they are just killers. These are like all-time bestseller fragrances. Cool Water, one of the only ones of this list that's on the fresher side of things. Actually, a lot of fragrances in the 80s, the big releases, were much more classically masculine, we'll say, and that they were very much in-your-face, heavy fragrances. Cool Water, though, much more of a chill, fresh spring, summertime scent. Now I want to get into 2 animalic fragrances, and these 2 are linked in my mind forever, for whatever reason, maybe because of the naming conventions of the 2 fragrances and the style of scent that they are, but they're linked up in my mind. First up, Yves Saint Laurent KOUROS. Ooh, KOUROS. A lot of people don't like this. A lot of people say it smells like, like pee. Like cat pee. It is aldehydic. It has civet in the fragrance as well. So animalic. It's got a bit of honey in there to add some sweetness though, so that's nice. There's also leather and musk and carnation. And carnation was a floral used in men's fragrances heavily in decades past. Nowadays, barely gets used at all. KOUROS is very strong. It's in your face. It can be a little bit astringent, especially if you're not used to it and you don't know what to expect. But I think that it is just an amazing scent. And it stands out so heavily against what Yves Saint Laurent does nowadays. It's night and day. And I adore the Y line from Yves Saint Laurent. I think it's fantastic for just versatile day-to-day use, but man, the difference between KOUROS and Y is the Grand Canyon. And the next fragrance I want to talk about, which again is linked in my mind to KOUROS, is ANTAEUS from Chanel. Oak moss, myrrh, rose, patchouli, and castoreum, some of the notes in the fragrance. I will say, especially if we're talking about modern batches of the fragrances, the ANTAEUS has more depth, more going on. It's a little bit richer, comes across a little more complex than KOUROS does. Again though, I love KOUROS, so no shots fired at the YSL whatsoever. The oak moss in here really shines for me, works together perfectly with the castoreum, gives it this kind of an earthy feel to it along with that animalic touch. It is just a killer fragrance. The bottle matches it perfectly. Absolutely nowadays overshadowed by Bleu de Chanel, overshadowed by the Egoist line, overshadowed by the Allure line, but this is a must-own if you're into 80s fragrances. This next fragrance has a punch to it. It's got good performance. It is really inexpensive nowadays. Definitely gonna give you a throwback vibe if you pick this up new. It is Versace L'Homme. Got the atomizer built into the top there, and it's a good atomizer too. This sprays out a bunch. It's got leather, oak moss, basil, lemon, and once again, carnation. Yeah, good old carnation. Now this one's got a punch to it. Like I said, the opening has a lemon, which is very much in your face. It's that old school kind of lemon. You're not gonna get this really creamy, sweet lemon. It's sharp, it's carrying a blade. It's gonna slash you. It's gonna cut you up. Then of course you've got that herbal green facet from basil, bit of oak moss as it dries down, and that carnation giving it a classically 80s masculine touch. I would say in terms of the quality of ingredients, Versace L'Homme nowadays, a little bit lower than KOUROS, lower obviously than ANTAEUS, but one of the most affordable, powerful, beastly 80s scents that you can buy, and absolutely worth every single penny nowadays. Now, keep in mind, these fragrances, all of them, they definitely do have that 80s feel to them. Some of them may smell a little more modern nowadays than some of the others, but they definitely harken back to the days of yore. I basically am just saying this because if you're a guy that's really into modern scents, you're not sure if you would like 80s fragrances because they might smell too old school to you, just keep that in mind, that these definitely do have that old school feel to them. Now, I absolutely think you can still pull these off, but if you shy away from fragrances that have that old school feel to them, keep that in mind, that these may have too much of that 80s vibe for you. Now, this next one is not overly hardcore masculine. This one has a nice sweet feel to it, a nice little bit of cinnamon, kind of an ambery feel. It is Obsession for Men from Calvin Klein. Of course, it's got that lavender, gotta have the lavender, but this one takes more of that inviting, sweet, warm kind of an approach instead of a bash you over the head masculine approach. And Obsession, in a way, was a precursor to a lot of fragrances that come out nowadays that do also take that warm, sweet, sexy, spicy, slightly subdued kind of approach to men's fragrances. Nowadays, Obsession maybe doesn't have enough oomph for some people, but I think that it still absolutely works, and it's one of the best fragrances that Calvin Klein has ever put out. Okay, this next one I don't really like. Of this whole bunch, this one is my least favorite, but really you can't talk about fragrances that came out in the 80s and not talk about this one. It is JOOP. Oh. It smells like it looks. Syrupy sweet, almost like cough syrup. It's got cinnamon, vanilla, tonka, and heliotrope as some of the notes in the fragrance, and it just never really worked for me. You know, I've tried to wear this a bunch over the years, and it just never was something that I could jive with, but I know lots of people out there loved and still love this fragrance. It is heavy. It projects strongly off my skin. It will choke people out mercilessly. You'll walk by people and they'll just go, well, maybe not that strong, but that's how it feels, especially if you've got a bunch of that on and you're in somewhere hot, like a club, or, you know, God forbid, out in really hot weather in the middle of summer or something. It's strong, okay? It's saccharine, sweet, and it is in your face. And it was a club fragrance of choice for countless people. And you know what? I've heard bunches of stories of how well this worked for those people that wore it. But for me, I just cannot roll with it. But in a way, that was, again, kind of like a precursor to some of the sweeter club fragrances that came many years down the road. Next up, we got a Hugo Boss, and it is Boss #1. Tobacco, oak moss, honey, and lavender. Some of the notes in the fragrance, just some 80s mainstays there with the notes. This one, got a pretty simple bottle, you know, kind of classy. Definitely got that 80s vibe to it. And it is just overwhelming for some people, this fragrance. Again, it's got a punch. It's got a heavy punch. It has what some people would consider animalic facets. It's, again, some people would say pissy smelling. I think it's fine. It does have some sharpness to it. Definitely has an aggressive side to it. It's strong, like a lot of these fragrances are, and frankly, 80s fragrances should be strong. Because in the 80s, if you were going out somewhere, your fragrance had to contend with cigarette smoke, and a lot of it. And we're talking indoors, you know, at restaurants, at bars, I don't know, literally everywhere. So the fragrances had to be able to cut through that cigarette smoke and make themselves known. And that's why a lot of fragrances from the 80s are so strong. Nowadays, that's not as much of an issue. You don't have cigarette smoke filling up the entire room when you walk in somewhere. So they don't really have to contend with much other than air-conditioned air. The 80s were a different time. So the fragrances, they've got more of a punch to them, and they should have. So Boss #1, that one is going to give you a little bit of a barbershop-y feel. Again, a lot of these fragrances have, you know, slight barbershop elements to them one way or another, some more so than others, but Boss #1 definitely has that. Just with a very strong 80s, slightly animalic, I was going to say undertone, but more overtone to it. Last fragrance, also from Davidoff, Zeno. This is still to this day a killer buy. The price that you can pick this up for, next to nothing. Smells similar to Beau de Jour from Tom Ford, which is, what, like 10 times the cost of this almost. The quality is still to this day surprisingly high for the scent, and it's just a classy bottle all the way around, I feel. It's actually a similar look to Cool Water, only if you took the bottle and made it shorter and wider and also black. You've got your lavender in here along with some more florals and a bunch of woody notes as well. As I said, similar to Beau de Jour, gonna give you that clean, fresh, masculine, gentlemanly, barbershop-y type scent profile. And it smells just fantastic. It's an amazing scent. There we go. 10 fragrances that helped define the 80s for me personally. Let me know in the comments below some fragrances that define the 80s for you. And when I say define the 80s, I don't mean a fragrance that was released in the 70s that was worn heavily in the 80s. I mean fragrances released in the 80s. All right, It's going to do it for me. Thanks for hanging out with me. Thanks for your support. Stay safe out there. See you tomorrow with another fragrance video. See you later.